Welcome back to the Convo Couch, ladies and gentlemen. We are back, and I am Pasta Jardula with Johnny Tsunami on the ones and twos. Thank you so much for hanging in there, ladies and gentlemen. We were shut down our stream a little bit from YouTube after the debate night. We did some fighting, but we got back in there, and we are here to stay, and we're going to stay up on everything to try to bring you the best independent media out there we can. And you know, we love to talk about the issues. We've been doing a lot of stuff on Epstein, and we thank all the new supporters, all the new Patreons out there. We're almost near 60, so if you got a few bucks to spare, join in on our Patreon. Help out independent media. We won't let you down. We cover the topics that are important. And one of the topics that are really important to us over here is election integrity. So today I have a special guest. I went out and got the best election integrity specialist, open source resource guy I could find out there. Today I have with me a person I like to call Brent, the Bulldog Turner. How you doing, Brent?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you doing?
You like that nickname?
I'll take it.
Well, I had to call you that after I saw you in that video standing on the stairs fighting for election integrity, which is one of the most important issues out there, because if we don't have election integrity, we have nothing. Am I right?
I'm with you. That's our position. We think that's a good place to focus first.
So let's talk about the main issue out here, which a lot of people don't know about. I went to a meeting with one of Dean Logan, Dean Logan is the Registrar of California, one of his assistants.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles, yes, with a bunch of activists, because he showed up. I think his name was Mr. Klein, Andrew Klein, or David Klein, or something like that. But he showed on up to talk to a bunch of activists about election integrity, because a lot of these activists were Bernie Sanders supporters, and they found out, what had happened through the grapevine in 2016, that a lot of votes went in the trash, and that Alex Padilla kind of tipped the scales for Hillary Clinton. But the problem is a lot of them didn't understand what open source versus closed source is. Can you tell our audience what open source versus closed source is in general?
I'll try to do it in a good layperson's speak, but also I would encourage the audience to go to Open Source Initiative.
Yes.
I think you can see them at opensource.org.
We have that right here for you too. It's okay. The number 4, Johnny, the open source initiative. So why don't you explain what that is?
And they give good detail, because you can, have good conversation and about just that. What is open source? But basically, it's a free software that is available to public inspection. So the code itself, when it's a public software, an open source software, it should be readily available to public inspection, which is the opposite of the current software used for voting, which is a closed source, unavailable for public inspection. So in other words, you can't look at it, you can't subpoena it, you just are not going to know what's going on inside that black box.
So you're saying it's proprietary software, pretty much, that it's owned by the company who makes the machine, and they don't let us look at it?
That's correct. And they run commonly on Microsoft platforms. And so now you've got a couple layers. You're not going to be able to see what Microsoft's doing, and you also are not going to be able to see what the vendor software code used for things like tabulating the votes. You're not going to be able to see that code either.
So you're saying there's a lot of what we like to say on this show, fugaziness going on when there's closed source, because we don't even have the rights to look at it, the public that be, right? Let's talk about open source. How does it actually work, though? When you say open source, that means it's open to everybody. What do they get? They get a code or a URL? Is it plugged into the internet? Break it down very simply, please. Open source.
There would be a like what we have currently. There would be a place where the public can go and see the code, and they could actually play with the code and enhance the code. So it's open to the public playing with the code and bettering the code. And then, of course, just so there's not confusion, the pushback from some is that, well, if you make the code available for everyone to see, doesn't that give the bad guys a head start? Because now you're providing them the code, and theoretically that might be considered as giving them a head start. But in the arena of defending these sorts of systems, we assume that the hacker is going to break through, quite likely break through whatever barriers you put up, whatever walls you have. So the idea with open source is you are still going to encase the code and protect it the same that you would protect a closed code. So the open source is not, as some naysayers will tell you, giving the bad guys a head start. You're
Yeah.
still going to encase the code regardless. The benefit of the open source code is, first of all, it changes the complete environment, the chain of custody issues. It changes a lot of the environment when you start working in the public space rather than in the corporate space.
Yeah.
And let's just say the bad guys do infiltrate your system. With an open source setting, you could see,
Who's coming
hopefully,
in, right?
with enough eyes on the code, you could see that and correct it. Whereas currently, if the bad guys get in, which we think they are likely to do, then you're never going to know, and you have no chance to correct the bug.
Yeah. Well, I think the big thing is that they want you to think that the bad guys are Russia, but really they are the bad guys kind of changing the election results themselves. But let's talk about a little bit more about open source. Are you saying that the machines are then connected to the internet so people can go on there and see it?
No. So ideally, and I am not a technology expert, nor am I a cybersecurity expert, but I think that you stipulate in this conversation with those nerds, you stipulate you want to stay as far away from the internet as you can with anything to do with an election. So just the only way to really get the best out of this setting is to disconnect completely from the internet. The problem is that in the current environment, the vendors are connected to the internet in their daily routines. So they carry the problems with them into the system. That's why we want to separate these private vendors out from the process. We want to relegate them to being service providers in a very controlled environment,
Yeah.
but no longer will they be providing this secret code that only they know about and only they're in charge of.
Well, let me ask you a question. Where did California get its machines from? Because when I asked the question, they gave me some company, but I've heard that it was a subsidiary company of maybe Microsoft or Amazon. The current new machines that they've been hyping, that Dean Cain and Alex Padilla and all these guys were like, we got these new machines. They're going to be great. They're going to print the slip up. You're going to go back in. You're going to be able to see it. Where do these machines come from, Brent?
Okay, so LA has a special circumstance there. Nationally, we have three vendors, basically. ES&S controls the majority of the market. Then you have Dominion, and you have Hart Intercivic. And these are the three predominant companies in this market. LA basically took our suggestion that we made to them about 15 years ago and started creating their own system. Yes. The problem is they didn't do it properly, so they brought in vendors to be involved in the project. They're calling it open source, but until they declare the code and put the code in a hub like GitHub, which is now even suspect in itself since Microsoft, who is the enemy to open source, purchased GitHub, which is another layer of confusion. But you would ideally have a nice receptacle for the code, and LA has not done that as of yet. They have not posted their code. So in the opinion of the Open Source Initiative, who is a good gatekeeper for these issues, the Los Angeles system does not qualify as an open source system at this time. There is hope, but the fact that they've kept their process secret from the public does not bode well. So we're guardedly optimistic, but also very, very guarded.
All right. Well, let's talk about this some more, because in that meeting that I went to with those activists for election integrity with Dean's assistant, he was stating up and down, no, we have open source now. We have open source. And I kept on asking him. Number 7 has the article from Alex Padilla. I kept asking him, well, where's the code? I said, if it's open source, shouldn't we have the code so we can see it to make sure it's open code? He couldn't give me an answer. Well, we don't have it yet. And we're putting up the Alex Padilla article right now, and it pretty much states that we are now using open source. So Alex Padilla is out there marching and speaking and rejoicing that we have open source, but that's just not the case, is it?
Not yet. And it is unfortunate that he would be so lax in his conversation here, because this is the crucial kernel element to the democracy, is whether or not the citizens' votes are being counted as they intend. And so currently, Alex Padilla has no idea, nor do any election officials nationally, what the heck is going on inside these systems. That's the one thing that is stipulated as a certainty, is they certainly do not know what's going on inside these systems, as it is a physical, literal, scientific impossibility for them to know anything. They're just taking the vendor's word for it. And usually there's vendor-trained seasonal workers coming into the counties that are with the vendors. They put on a different outfit so it looks like they're working for the county, but they come out of a training system inherent to the vendors, and they know how to work the systems, but the county official is one step removed, which is obviously problematic.
Well, being an open source specialist like yourself, do you know what percentage of the nation's polling machines are open source versus closed source? Are there any is there any state that has, in the country that has open source really, that we can say, look at this state, look at this city, we need to do this, we need to mimic this right here?
The closest we have is New Hampshire, who has utilized an open source system for their disability components. And but they're not tabulating with open source, which is the last domino to fall. And where that resistance comes from, we don't really know. Secretary of State Bill Gardner has been good enough to wade in and have open source components with his system, but the fact that they haven't completed their system disallows us from using it as a true model. We're hoping San Francisco fills that role, and we're hoping that build out begins as soon as possible.
It seems to me that the tabulation part would be the best way. Like, in other words, make everything open source, but leave the tabulation closed source, and that's where you can change the numbers.
Correct. You're still doing nothing except you're demonstrating the viability of an open source component, which is great because these are baby steps. But with the environment and everything else, I think we had better move quickly right now and stop talking about this and start getting rid of the proprietary systems that we know can never be secured, because that's just science. So we need to start adhering to the science and moving toward these better public systems.
So pretty much Alex Padilla is touting open source, but we have vendors coming in to complete the whole process, so we know the fact that it's not complete open source because he hasn't given us the code. How is he trying to fool Californians? Is it with the language of saying it's open source, but it's really not open source? Is that his whole mechanism and what he's trying to do? Because I don't think they're going to act on this, and I think they're going to go with what they got.
Well, for 2020,
yes.
For 2020, we're done. I mean, we're going to be using the same systems we used in 2008.
For you guys in San Francisco, not in L.A.
Everywhere. We're going to be using proprietary systems everywhere in the United States for tabulating the votes. So, in other words, whoever loses would have a good position to say, I don't trust that vote count. Prove to me that you know what's going on inside that black box. And we're right back to having to stipulate nobody knows what's real here.
Yeah.
So San Francisco, if they start with their project, our goal is by 2024 we might be able to have something decent in place that could be used as a proper model. And let us state here that when we say open source systems, these are open source paper ballot systems. So we don't lose the paper ballot. We have the paper ballot in conjunction with the open source. The twist on a lot of these so-called good governance groups and what they're doing, as lots of them have relationship with Microsoft, so their motivations are impure. But what they're pushing is paper ballot, getting everybody to chant paper ballot, which
Yeah.
is good. But what they leave out is the open source piece. And unless you have open source software counting the ballots, you're not going to secure a system just via the paper ballot. It's still incomplete from a security perspective.
Well, let's stay on the paper ballot thing real quick, because I had a guest on a couple weeks ago, and I planned to go 1-2 with you guys, and you had a little bit of a disagreement. It was Tim Canova, and he's experienced some things down in South Florida twice to Debbie Wasserman Schultz, stuff that they say is just ridiculous and can never happen. But he seems to have jumped on that ship of let's hand count the ballots. And I think when people are sold their paper ballots that will have track of them, we'll be able to count them. But you said yourself, when you go to an open source system, it even opens up the way these ballots are handled and counted, because now they just can't be taken off anywhere. The whole, the whole control mechanism with open source is different. Is it possible to go to a hand counting system at all?
It's very, very, very unlikely to ever happen in the United States. We haven't seen a speck of political will toward hand counting, and the reason that that is the case is the officials are using the technology, and there's volume that is cumbersome, and there's a lot of different issues that makes hand counting a literal non-starter in the United States. Now, people would argue with that and say, yeah, that's what we should do. We have to strategize in the real world here. And to the best of our capability as the leading science group on this issue, the best method is to have a perfectly printed paper ballot so that there's no voter intent issues. You don't have any scribbly lines or faces or disqualified ballots or arguing about what the voter intended. You have a perfect ballot, and you use a simple open source scanner tabulation system.
Yeah.
And at the end of that process, those ballots are sitting right there. We suggest, if you want to get a hand count, you do that at the precinct level, previous to transportation, recount them right there. But if you take a look at the system that we recommend with a big screen and public involvement, you've basically hand counted them already once by the time a regular recount would begin. And we encourage that recount. We want this to be proper.
Yeah.
I just want to make one more mention that we feel there is a disingenuous element within the so-called activist community that knows damn well that there is not going to be recounting, and that there's not going to be hand counting.
Yeah.
And they preach it anyway while fundraising off the issue, and at the same time omitting the open source movement from the conversation.
Yeah.
So there's an extra layer of filth involved here that people should be aware of. Even the grassroots community is being gamed when it comes to elections.
What you're telling me seems to make sense, that some people are really being genuine about it, like the Tim Canovas, like the people we know that say, hey, let's just get the best way, let's count these. But there's also another part of the community, and you've mentioned this to me before, with all these activists that have been co-opted to just really throw another monkey wrench in, to cause more confusion, to cause another layer of distraction and not get the proper count. Let me ask you one final question. In California, where should people call? Should they call Dean Logan's office? And where should they call nationwide? Should they call their registrar to complain about this? Where can we flood the phones? Where can my people pick up the phone and give some people some guff on what's going on to get this straightened out at?
Okay, well, on the national level, HR 1 came out, and we saw, even though the feds don't have much say over these state election practices, when HR 1 came out, we pushed for open source technology to be in that language along with the paper ballots. And Microsoft / verified voting, they made sure that language was not in there. So people like Nancy Pelosi, our woman, Congresswoman here, Jackie Spear, and others, your Congress people should be told we want open source in the federal bill, to Ron Wyden's bill as well, to send a message to the states.
Yeah.
That being said, they should really call their Secretary of State, and specifically they can call their county registrar and say, and their board of supervisors, letting them know we don't want to purchase any more of these proprietary systems. They're proven terminally flawed from a security perspective. Keep what you got, stand in place. If you have to get something in your county, lease it with a strong opt-out clause, and then start pushing your county to contact San Francisco and talk about this open source build out, and how if San Francisco can complete a system and get it certified in California, that can be used and be shared with counties all across the country.
Yeah.
So basically it starts on a very local level, but you can take it all the way up to the top in speaking with your congressional representatives.
This is one of the most important issues to me because, election integrity. If we don't have election integrity, we have nothing. We'll never get the will of the people. And getting into this open source, closed source kind of discussions and understanding what goes on, it really is just mind-boggling because we're getting screwed. They have all this proprietary software inside those machines. I even heard in some of the Florida machines they had modems. So I don't know if that's true or not or what's going on, but it surely is disgusting. What do you think about exit polling, by the way?
Exit polling, out of all polling, polling we find childlike because there's no security controls, and obviously everything in our current world is being manipulated. Exit polling is probably the best polling, but still, and it does highlight, the inefficiencies of the current system, so we appreciate that. There were anomalies, statistical anomalies in the swing states where it appears that, something may have gone horribly wrong in those particular areas. So we appreciate that. We appreciate all the efforts that go into a proper system, but really none of it will amount to much unless we get this software piece right. And this is the piece that, interestingly and obviously, has been left out of the conversation. Now Tulsi and some other candidates are starting to get smart on this. As a matter of fact, Tulsi Gabbard was the first to put it in her federal legislation. So, that's a good sign, but we need to really embrace it and get with the experts. And like you mentioned in Los Angeles, what's going on now is you get these groups that are the pretend experts.
Yeah.
Johnny come lately's on the scene. And they want to nuance the licenses and insert themselves to drive it back down the slippery slope to a proprietary controlled environment. And the purists from the open source community, like Brian Fox and others that I work with at the California Association of Voting Officials, they are holding the line along with our friends at Open Source Initiative to say the license should be a general public license, a GPL, and that's really all the public needs to know. If they can just keep those letters in their head, the GPL, general public license. There is not a more efficient license for this particular issue of voting and election systems when it comes to open source. So you'll see some of these new wise guys like open source election technologists and verified voting. They're now talking about nuancing the general public license again, so they can take a control position, and we're watchdogging the space vehemently.
Well, we got a lot of Johnny come latelys, but I'm glad today I had a Brent come savage on my show, and thank you for being such a guard dog, watchdog. I'm going to pass this on to my activist friends in LA and tell them to get on the horn and let Alex Padilla know, let Dean Cain know we want real open source, not this fugazi open source where there's proprietary software, and we want to make sure we have it today. And thank you so much, Brent Turner. Where can we find you, and what else can we learn from you before we send you away?
Well, if anybody wants to contact me, my email is turnerbrentam at gmail, turnerbrentam@gmail.com. And they can look at the CONVO website. There's a lot of information there at convo-us.org, CAVO. And, we're available for conversation. We feel like this is the most important issue of our time, the most important civil rights issue. It's basically Jim Crow happening again. The front end disenfranchisement happens, and we can witness that. But what's particularly insidious about this back end disenfranchisement of the software code manipulation is the voter leaves thinking they accomplished their goal of voting, and in reality they're still being twisted. So we have to figure this one out.
Thanks for joining us, Brent Turner. We really appreciate it. We'll speak to you soon. We'll get an update on what's going on. You come back and talk to us?
Anytime. My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, you got it, Brent. Brent the Bulldog Turner out over there in San Francisco. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching. I'm Pastor Jardula for Johnny Sue on the ones and two. It's great to be back. If you got a few bucks you want to spare on the Patreon to help us out, please do so. Fee's going to be back. I'm going to be back. We're waiting for Nico to get his status back. Thank you so much. CONVO out.